What if the Police were a prog rock band? That's the questionable premise we'll be investigating on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that every week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring this alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Don't Stand So Close to Me by The Police, and I tried to reimagine that as a progressive rock song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, for such a massive band with such wide-ranging appeal, I've always thought the Police were a bit of an odd case because they're pretty universally considered to have been part of the whole punk and new wave movement. But to me, musically, they've never sounded like they actually have that much connection to that. And certainly if you look at the musical backgrounds of the members of the band, they couldn't really be much further removed from anything punky or new wavy. And if you look back just a couple of years before they actually started the band, Stuart Copeland was drumming for Curved Air, the old prog band, who definitely did some pretty interesting stuff, but very far removed from punk. And Sting played sort of stand-up bass in a big band, but then he'd also been in Last Exit, who were kind of a jazz funk fusion band. So distinctly non-punky, but I guess Stuart Copeland had heard some of the first rumblings of punk and got interested in that. So when Curved Air fell apart in 1976, he was looking to do something a bit more contemporary. So that first lineup of the Police, it's those two tucking their more muso-y backgrounds out of the way, and Henry Padovani, who tends to be completely forgotten in the Police story, I think, who's a French guitar player who was only briefly a member of the band, but he plays on their first single, which is, to my ears, by far the best thing that the Police ever did. Certainly the A-side anyway, the song Fallout is absolutely great. It's this spiky little 2-minute song. It's the only thing they ever did that really sounded like a punk song. Really great. And Henry Padovani's guitar, this really aggressive, obnoxious tone that he's got, is fantastic. Great little single, and I think if they carried on along those lines, they probably would genuinely be considered to be a punk band, but they also probably wouldn't be the stadium conquering phenomenon that they became. Because yeah, that lineup of the band didn't last too long. The other two members of the band found Henry's guitar playing to be a bit subpar for them. I guess they were used to playing with pretty slick prog and jazz musicians, so they initially brought in Andy Summers as a second guitarist and then eventually became the sole guitarist a little while later. Andy Summers had an even less punky background than the other two. He was 10 years older than everyone else in the band, so he was already a veteran by the time he joined the Police, and he came from a proper psych and art rock background. He played in Eric Burdon's later lineups of the Animals, on some of that psychedelic stuff he was doing in the late 60s. He played in the Soft Machine, so he got ties to that whole art rock scene as well. So really as far removed from punk as you could possibly be, but a great guitar player and pretty musically open-minded. So he joins the band, and I guess from that point on they keep a little bit of that punky energy in there, but there's nothing that really sounds like punk rock. I think a lot of that continued perception of them is probably partly due to just timing, the fact that they were there during that era, partly a bit due to image. I guess they still had the short, scruffy, bleached hair, which I always thought was probably an urban legend, but I think it's possibly true that they actually got those hairdos for a Wrigley's gum commercial that never ended up airing, which is absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, somehow they managed to tap tap into a little bit of that punk rock energy, also tap into a bit of the fusion between rock and reggae that was happening at that time, combine it with their own highly accomplished playing, some of that art rock background as well, and just an instinct for really great pop songwriting, and translate all of that into a coherent product that became this massive chart-topping, stadium-filling sensation. I can't deny the greatness of some of those records. Message in a Bottle, So Lonely, all those tracks, but I've never really been a fan. I can definitely enjoy the odd song, but I've never wanted to put on a whole album of The Police. I've never quite managed to pinpoint exactly why that is. Just while I was making this video, it dawned on me that perhaps the reason why they've never quite gelled with me is just that for all that they captured a bit of that new wave energy and spirit, they've always sounded a bit to me like they should just be a prog band. Like in terms of the playing, although the punky energy's there, none of them can resist these little displays of this overt virtuoso musicianship. It just keeps creeping in there. But I think the main thing that's always jarred a bit with that idea of them being in any way connected with punk is just Sting's voice. It's so far removed from any kind of punk tradition. It's got that thing that a lot of British prog rock singers have, that thing where you can tell a singer has listened to a certain amount of classic rock and classic soul from their delivery, but you also kind of get the feeling that they were head choir boy. So that kind of high purity, as well as some of those soul and rock inflections, I can definitely hear parallels to some of the stuff that Peter Gabriel was doing back in his Genesis days. I can certainly hear parallels to what John Anderson was doing in Yes, and to me he's always sounded much closer to those kind of singers than to anyone in the punk or new wave scenes. So, I mean, obviously they were doing something right. The blend of different sounds and influences they brought was the perfect thing for that time, but I think I would have just enjoyed them more if they'd just given up trying to be new wavy and had just admitted that they were really a prog band. I should say at this juncture, I am mainly an old punk, so I have no business really listening to prog rock or being interested in it. But before I fully dived into punk at the age of about 14, I did definitely have a few years of getting quite heavily into a fair bit of old prog, and I never quite got over that. It's always been there. I kept hold of most of those records, and I will still go back to them from time to time. So it's always been something I've enjoyed, even if I've not necessarily shouted about it too much in punk circles. I can understand why plenty of my fellow punks would deride prog, because it is all of the things that critics say it is. It's overblown and it's pretentious. It tends to take itself far too seriously. Certainly quite a lot of it, initially at least, was the preserve of a generation of very privileged white male public school boys, and it struggled to shake off a certain amount of that perception. So there are plenty of valid reasons to dislike it, but I think there are also plenty of reasons to love it, because it can be tremendous fun, wildly imaginative, challenging and exciting, breaking rock music out of these narrow-minded little categories that it boxes itself into. So I do think it's worth investigating before you dismiss it out of hand if you are an old punker who's just taken a look at one Yes album cover and gone, no, not for me. I guess really progressive rock as a genre grew out of the experiments of the latter half of the 60s, from baroque pop and chamber pop to some of the psychedelic rock experimentation that was going on, the various experiments that people had in combining rock music with classical. People like Deep Purple were engaged in towards the end of the 60s, and the movement to combine jazz and rock, which was happening with the likes of Miles Davis and Don Ellis were doing in the late 60s as well. So all of those influences were absolutely feeding into this new music that's developing. And the main proponents of it, as I say, probably were largely kids who'd come from quite privileged backgrounds, often public school kids who had that kind of classical music education. So a lot of classically trained musicians, but who were also getting turned on to late 60s rock as teenagers, and it was just natural that they wanted to combine their quite high-level musical skills that they'd developed from their education with rock music. So by about 1970, there's just a glut of this music appearing, different groups trying to stretch rock in different directions that hadn't been tried before. So you have the likes of Emerson, Lake and Palmer doing these vastly amplified electric renditions of classical pieces. You have Genesis, creating these surreal theatrical extended opuses, combining this elaborate complex rock music with elements of Dadaism and music hall. You've got King Crimson, who are heading into jazzy and avant-garde areas, doing some really kind of wild, dark stuff. Pink Floyd, who are less concerned with the more elaborate displays of musicianship and more concerned with creating these immersive ambient musical environments for exploring these increasingly complex lyrical themes. So all kinds of stuff going on. And, some of it was terrible, but some of it was incredible. And for a few years, there really was some quite astonishing music coming out of the various different strands of progressive rock that were happening. Obviously, as it caught on and people started to make more money and egos got bigger and people started to do more cocaine, things got out of hand fairly quickly. While a few of these bands do keep making valid, inspiring art, quite a lot of them did fairly rapidly spiral out of control. I mean, definitely Emerson, Lake and Palmer touring with this ridiculous setup that required a gigantic truck for each member of the band's equipment. Yes, with Tales of the Topographic Oceans, this completely impenetrable triple LP, is it? I've never managed to make my way through it. Rick Wakeman's solo works as well, with his The Wives of Henry VIII on Ice, or these preposterous conceits that some of these acts were coming up with, just teetering over that point from exciting experimentation into reckless indulgence. So by the time punk rock was rolling around, some of this stuff definitely needed to be taken down a peg or two and cleared out. But I think a lot of the best of prog endured either in spirit or in actuality. I mean, you definitely, once you've had a couple of years of punk kind of wiping out some of this stuff, you do see some cool stuff cropping up again, like the 1980s incarnation of King Crimson, where they took some of the more exciting elements of the 70s versions of the band, but reinvigorated it with this new lineup that had this very contemporary new wavy edge to it as well. And a few other prog bands did manage kind of successful 80s reinventions, sometimes even very commercially successful. So it's never quite gone away. And then as time's gone on, you get new generations of prog bands forming. I'm totally out of the loop with contemporary prog. I couldn't tell you who's worth listening to now, Spock's Beard or whoever. But then also elements of prog get incorporated into other genres. So there's a whole subset of progressive metal with the likes of Dream Theater and whoever, and even punk bands incorporating elements of prog. So from even back in the 80s, the likes of No Means No, who combine hardcore punk with these much more extended, complex song structures, or as a more contemporary example, Fucked Up, who make these huge, sprawling, epic pieces with these densely layered psychedelic textures, which absolutely hark back to a lot of the more exciting prog rock as well. So yeah, it's a funny genre overall. As I say, there's lots of negative stuff you can say about it, but a lot of those negatives in the right hands can be positives too. But anyway, just to get back to my alternative universe scenario to explain this week's track. In my alternative timeline this week, so we're going back to 1977. The Police have just formed. It's the initial lineup with Sting and Stuart Copeland and Henry Padovani. They've been hungry to get involved in this contemporary punk stuff. They want to be part of that scene, but after a couple of months, they've already started to get a little bit sick of it. They've released this debut single and, it's pretty good, but the punks are a bit suspicious of them. They sense a bit of a whiff of inauthenticity about them, and they're already starting to get a little bit tired of being gobbed on at gigs. So Stuart Copeland and Sting are starting to think maybe we've been a bit too hasty getting involved in this punk thing. Both come from these more musicianly backgrounds. Maybe we should do something a bit more like that. Henry Padovani doesn't come from that background. He's not really into that, doesn't want to be involved in that, couldn't play that kind of music even if he wanted to. So he's out. Instead, they recruit Andy Summers, and with him in place, with his art rock background, they immediately move away from the punkier sounding stuff and quickly start reworking these pop rock songs that they've been writing into intricate prog epics. Eventually they get round to recording their debut album, and it's a concept album based partly on Sting's real life experience as a teacher, and it details over the course of its 4 sides the mental breakdown of a teacher after his inappropriate relationship with a pupil. So they're making this record. They get Rick Wakeman from Yes in to come and play some elaborate keyboards on it as well. And they release Don't Stand So Close to Me as the single, and obviously anyone who was into them during their brief punk phase absolutely hates it and they immediately reject it. The press don't like it either, but the band finds themselves welcomed with open arms on the European festival circuit, so they disappear off to the mainland and just tour around all these festivals for a few years, building up a small but loyal following who continue to follow them for years to come. So it was an interesting process attempting to turn Don't Stand So Close to Me into a prog track. I should just say before I start, I've never been a massive fan of the song. I do find its lyric to be super creepy. It's interesting reading about how Sting talks about it now, because I know he's increasingly tried to distance himself from it, but then there are earlier interviews with him where he does suggest that it has some kind of autobiographical basis. Yeah, it's not a pleasant lyric, but structurally and in terms of the chords, I thought there was a lot I could do with it, so that's why I picked it. As ever with these things, I started by just taking the isolated lead vocal and dropping it into GarageBand. Now, this was a particularly challenging one because I decided that it being prog rock, I wanted to have lots of time signature changes. It's not an easy thing to do in GarageBand because you have a strict tempo grid, so it's a lot of editing of the vocal involved to just hack it up to make those rhythmic changes work, but I got there more or less in the end. There's a couple of clunky edits, but I think it's okay. Put the drums on next, which again was quite tricky with the time signature changes. I think there are bits that are in straight 7/8, then we've got some double time bits where we're alternating between 4/4 and 7/8, so it's an absolute swine. Added some bass next. For the bass, I was really trying to capture a little bit of that Chris Squire from Yes tone with that really forthright, mid-rangey, obnoxious tone that he had. I don't have a Rickenbacker, which would have been the ideal thing, but I tried to do as much as I could with the amp and the EQ to get some of that sound. Guitar-wise, we've got a couple of things happening on there. There's relatively clean rhythm track, which is just generally playing a chordal accompaniment, apart from in the breakdown verse, which gets a bit of a King Crimson inspired thing where the regular beat stops and we've got the entire band playing just a sort of figure in unison behind the vocal. And I think there, that track's just playing the same melody as everything else, but otherwise it's just playing a kind of fairly standard chordal rhythm part underneath. And we've got a lead track that plays a bit of a solo over the intro, just as a way to bring the song in. And then later on, during the choruses, it's doing a bit of a two-handed tapping figure, keeping an arpeggiated thing going on underneath the vocal, which is basically me attempting to pay homage to Steve Hackett from Genesis, who was a real pioneer of that kind of thing. It was an absolute swine to play. It took lots of attempts, lots of edits to get a whole performance that just about worked, but got there in the end. I guess the main burden in terms of instrumentation falls on the keyboards. There's a lot of keyboards on there. So started off with just a Hammond organ, which mainly just provides a chordal pad, apart from again in the breakdown verse where it's playing the melody. On top of that, I added a couple of different bits of mellotron sounds, because the mellotron I think was quite a fixture of prog stuff. A keyboard player who had classical aspirations and couldn't afford an orchestra was going to be using a mellotron, because obviously you could record actual orchestral sounds and use them in there. So we've got some mellotron strings and also some mellotron flutes on there, just playing different things. And then I've also got a couple of different bits of synths in there too. So I've got an analog sounding lead that crops up playing a few bits, including a little solo before the out chorus. And I've also got an arpeggiated synth that comes in the later choruses, playing a parallel line to what the two-handed tapping lead guitar is doing as well. And then for the video, as ever, started out by just finding a decent live performance of the Police doing the song. And then because there were a lot of keyboards on there, and obviously the Police are a three-piece, decided I needed to edit in an authentically prog-looking keyboard player. Who better to pick than Rick Wakeman? So we've got Rick Wakeman in his ridiculous robe, playing various bits of keyboards, edited in there too. I thought it'd be good to have a more proggy-looking crowd in attendance at this concert. I think actually the audience footage that I've edited in in there is from a Led Zeppelin gig, but at least they're kind of long-haired and look a bit more like the kind of people who you'd expect to see at a prog concert. And then as a final touch, as I often do, I mocked up a few concert posters to just pop the Police in more of a prog rock context and suggest that they're part of that scene. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It was very enjoyable for me trying to put this one together. It was quite a challenge converting this 3-minute kind of pop rock song into a mini prog epic with all these different sections, but it was great fun trying to figure out how I was going to do that. So if you did enjoy it, please let me know down in the comments, and if you could like and subscribe, that always really helps. I really appreciate your support. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months as well, any songs you'd like me to take on, any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, or any artists you'd like me to take a look at, also do let me know. I always appreciate your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.